So, welcome everyone tonight to Merton College to the inaugural series of Oxford Humanitas lectures in the history of ideas. We're delighted to be hosting this exciting new series of events, and we're especially grateful for the generosity of one Francis Finley, member of this college, and for his generosity has made these lectures possible. And we're also very grateful to Lord Weidenfeld, the originator of the Humanitas lectures in Oxford and Cambridge, and to the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. It's my very great pleasure now to introduce Professor Lorraine Daston. She's our inaugural visiting professor for this series, and Professor Daston is renowned as one of the world's leading historians of science. She's currently director of the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. This is as well as being visiting professor of social thought and history at the University of Chicago. The many books she has written and co-written include Classical Probability and the Enlightenment and Wonders and the Natural Order of Nature, both of which were awarded the Pfizer Prize by the History of Science Society. Professor Daston has recently also been honoured with the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany and with the Sarton Medal of the History of Science Society. I gather that Professor Daston gave a lecture fairly recently at the Royal Society, I think this was just last year, on the subject of weather watching, which is something that I think we've all been doing in the last day or two, and especially today. And I'm very glad that the weather, such as it is, with its snow and its ice, have not stopped her making the journey from Berlin to here. Professor Daston's lecture will continue with the theme of unpredictable weather. Its title is Nature's Revenge, A History of Risk, Responsibility and Reasonableness. Rainey, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Round of applause.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction, and my thanks as well to the Humanitas program, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and Merton College for their hospitality and also for their vote of confidence in entrusting this charge to me. I confess to a special debt of gratitude to Mr. Finley, if Mr. Finley it was, who decided to christen these lectures in the history of ideas. Until very recently, and perhaps still, in the corner of the academic map that I come from, to call someone a historian of ideas is tantamount to calling them a tax evader or a cat murderer. We have witnessed in history, the history of science at least, and I suspect that general history is no exception, 2 decades of work with the historical microscope, a probing of the local details, the filigree texture of the everyday, the contextual. And there's no doubt that we've all benefited enormously from the revelations of that approach. But sometimes it is pleasant to complement the work of the microscope with the telescope. And that is what the history of ideas does. The telescope perhaps will not deliver such a treasure trove of personal and quirky stories, but it can reveal patterns that would be invisible at the pixelated level of the microscope, and that is what I hope to provide today. I'm going to lower the lights a little bit here because I hope you can see at least the outline of the world map superimposed here. In March 2011, an earthquake followed by a tsunami devastated Japan. In August of 2005, Hurricane Katrina laid waste to the city of New Orleans and stretches of the Gulf Coast. In the summer of 2002, floods overwhelmed Dresden, Prague, and other Central European cities. And what you see here, I'm sorry that, although it comes forth quite clearly on the screen in front of me, I suspect that you cannot see, but these are disasters superimposed on a world map. This is North and South America here. Here is Europe, and you can see the litany of what in German is inimitably called Unwetter. These sudden violent catastrophes are the sorts of events that liability law and insurance companies call acts of God. In French, force majeure, in German, höhere Gewalt. That is, events that are so rare, so overwhelming, that no human foresight or power could have foreseen or averted them. Although natural disasters like floods, volcanoes, earthquakes, and tempests have been interpreted by the devout in some cultures and epochs as divine punishment for human malfeasance, as in, for example, the biblical story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the legal term, act of God, does not point an accusing finger at human culprits. Quite the contrary. To ascribe a disaster to an act of God, or to cognate phrases in other European languages, is to exonerate humans of all responsibility. Since Roman times, there has been a legal escape clause for the casus fortuitus, or event due to vis maior, before which human prudence and human action are powerless and therefore not liable for the damage caused. In the recent past, the prototypical such case of no human responsibility has been the natural disaster. As the New York Times editorialized after the 1980 eruption of the volcano Mount St. Helens in the Pacific Northwest, there was some calm consolation to be drawn from the fact that, however catastrophic the consequences of the volcano for life and for property, at least there was no one to blame. Sorry. Scientists, I'm now reading from the New York Times editorial, scientists think the blast approximated that of the biggest hydrogen bomb ever tested. But no matter how disastrous, there is one thing to be said for Mount St. Helens: no guilt. There is nothing anyone should have or could have done about it, end quote. Such natural disasters stood in stark contrast to the environmental disaster at Love Canal, the subject of another editorial on the very same page that skewered the American Environmental Protection Agency for its mismanagement of the affair. In the Love Canal case, the mischief was man-made and blame was laid at the feet of many culprits. In the Mount St. Helens case, indignation would be absurd. As the New York Times concluded, you can't blame a volcano. But natural disasters like the 2002 floods that washed over Dresden or Hurricane Katrina are increasingly described not as acts of God, but as instances of nature's revenge, and not just by the sensation-seeking press or by the metaphorically minded. In contrast to the exculpatory connotations of an act of God in the legal sense, the phrase nature's revenge points an accusing finger. These so-called natural disasters are in part due to human activities. Someone is responsible, perhaps even legally liable, for the damages caused. An August 30th, 2005 New York Times editorial entitled Nature's Revenge expressed this idea clearly in connection with Hurricane Katrina. The damage caused by a hurricane like Katrina is almost always called a natural disaster, but it is also unnatural in the sense that much of it is self-inflicted. New Orleans is no exception, and while the city has been spared a direct hit from the storm, its politicians and planners must rethink the bad policies that contributed to the city's vulnerability. Recent sociological studies of natural disasters, like the hurricanes that periodically wreak havoc in southern Florida in the United States, the heat waves that killed scores of people in Europe in 2003, point out that mighty financial interests encourage reckless building along hurricane paths, and that equally mighty political interests trap the poor and the elderly in the hottest parts of big cities. These studies blame policies that promote risk and vulnerability, but do not go so far as to suggest that bad policies cause hurricanes or heat waves. There is, however, a second, stronger line of argument that takes the phrase of nature's revenge more robustly. In the case of the 2002 floods, for example, in Central Europe, environmental historians have pointed out that since the 18th century, attempts to rectify the course of major rivers like the Rhine, to drain wetlands, to build dams, or to dredge artificial harbors have always had unintended negative consequences, including more and more severe flooding. So what you see here is, this is the natural course of the Rhine here, and you see it's a sinuous meander. And here is one of the earlier attempts to rectify the course of the Rhine by making a cut through one of the meanders. Now this has the advantage, obviously, of shortening the route. It has the disadvantage in that when the water level rises, it flows much faster through the straight channel and is more likely to overflow its banks. The Independent blamed the outbreak of wildfires in Southern California in October 2007 on heedless real estate development. Mother Nature's revenge against human development, so ran the headline. Scientists and activists investigating climate change have advanced the strongest and most urgent case for human culpability in natural disasters. In all of these cases, nature's revenge is meant as more than a metaphor, even if the phrase is still tinged with anthropomorphism. By meddling with the delicate balance of topography, organisms, and climate, human beings have unwittingly unleashed destructive forces beyond human control, from malicious motives, if not with malice aforethought. In the past 20 years, there has been a gradual but ultimately dramatic reversal of the intellectual respectability of the attitudes encapsulated by phrases such as acts of God and nature's revenge. Not so long ago, say 1980, at the time of the Mount St. Helens volcanic explosion, the legal recognition of catastrophes for which no one was responsible, which were regrettable but beyond human reckoning or control, seemed a mark of progress. We had rid ourselves of the yoke of religious portents and chastisements, of reading divine wrath into events that were just part of the course of nature. To look for culprits for the damage caused by droughts or hurricanes seemed as benighted as witch hunting. But now, enlightened opinion increasingly wonders whether natural disasters are really all that natural, and poses hard questions about human responsibility. Nor is this the view of just a minority of activists and alarmists. The title of a collection recently published by the World Bank and the United Nations points the direction in which the new wind is blowing. The title is Natural Hazards, Unnatural Disasters, the Economics of Effective Prevention. Nature's revenge is not just a secularized version of divine wrath, nor is the anthropomorphism of the metaphor to be taken seriously by those who use it. They rarely impute intentions to nature, a mind-boggling abstraction that demands all the ironic skills of the cartoonist to turn into an allegorical figure, as in this cartoon after the Copenhagen climate debate. The metaphor of nature's revenge is just that. It is a metaphor, but it condenses a powerful idea about the relationship between human beings and their environments into an emotionally charged image. This lecture is about both idea and emotion, a history of thinking about risk, responsibility, and reasonableness when the natural order capsizes into disorder. There is a master narrative about modernity that pulls historians along like swimmers in an undertow. Here's how the story goes. The core of modernity is the process of secularization, in which codes of belief and conduct that were once justified in religious terms persist in modern societies, but now shorn of all reference to the divine. Militant atheists celebrate Christmas. Secular liberal polities like France still uphold originally Christian values like fraternité. Work-free weekends faintly echo the Judeo-Christian Sabbath. Forms endure long after religious content withers. Romantic historians may tell this tale as an elegy, mourning the disenchantment of the world. Their progressivist colleagues recount it with zest, celebrating the triumph of reason over superstition. However it's inflected, it is the same story. At first glance, the transition from the pre-modern wrath of God to the modern nature's revenge seems tailor-made for this familiar narrative. Just as the divine edicts of medieval and early modern theology have given way to the natural laws of science, so God's wrath has been replaced by nature's revenge. The volcano or the flood or the storm may be just as devastating in the one case as in the other. But at least it's no longer personal. The victims are not being punished for their sins by an angry deity who holds them individually to account. They are at worst reaping what they have sown collectively. So goes the secularization account, which is alive and well in the recent historiographies of natural disasters. My argument is that this narrative, despite its go-with-the-flow temptations, obscures more than it illuminates. This is not just because plenty of people in so-called modern societies still subscribe to the wrath of God explanation of natural disasters. And I don't think the story is entirely false in its emotional charge. Fear of nature, even nature writ large, has a qualitatively different texture than fear of God, as Lucretius recognized. However, the glib equation of nature's revenge as the secular successor of divine wrath leapfrogs over one of the most innovative episodes in the long human history of trying to make sense of misfortune, namely the creation of a special category of the distinctively natural disaster, ontologically and also morally distinct from other kinds of trials and tribulations. Although this category of the natural disaster is thoroughly modern in spirit, it is a product of the Enlightenment, it was forged primarily by theologians, not by philosophers, not by natural philosophers. Enlightened theologians were in the van in conceptualizing nature as a vast, complex, self-regulating economy in which divine providence exquisitely balanced good and bad. The modern figure of nature's revenge traces its intellectual genealogy primarily back to these origins, not to the older figure of God's wrath. No nature's revenge without self-regulating nature. In order to appreciate the magnitude of their originality, we must very briefly examine the notions that preceded it. Medieval Latin has no special word or phrase to pick out misfortunes that were due to natural as opposed to human or divine causes. Instead, there are just tribulationes. Bad things happen. There is famine, there is plague, there are vermin, there are foreign conquerors, there are searing heat waves, soaking rains. Christian theologians agreed that all of these trials were sent by God, but of course their interpretations about just why and how were nuanced and varied. So I'll just give you one very quick example. The very unlucky year of 1348. The outbreak of the Black Death in Florence seems to have been immediately interpreted as divine punishment by local preachers. But only 2 out of the 25 reports commissioned from the Parisian Faculty of Medicine on the same disease in the same year mention divine wrath as a possible cause. They dwell instead on natural causes such as miasma or ill-starred astrological conjunctions. When the plague persisted, divine wrath explanations did spread, but they never succeeded in driving out natural causes in plague treatises. The severe earthquake that shook northern Italy and destroyed the Carpathian village of Villach, also in 1348, was much commented upon but rarely interpreted as divine retribution by contemporaries. And even among those whose consciences were troubled by the event, like the bankers in nearby Udine, their repentance was decidedly measured. As a sign of their remorse for their greed, they forgave their debtors a full 8 days of interest. Despite the diversity of medieval interpretations of catastrophes, a few general points hold. First, although certain kinds of disasters, for example, earthquakes and plague, like the 1348 examples, might be consistently understood in contrasting ways, the fault lines don't run along the natural-supernatural divide or the human-natural divide. So other distinctions, for example, between punctual, infrequent cataclysms and recurring or sustained ones seem to have been more salient. Within this framework, plague and drought belong in one category, earthquakes and enemy siege in another. Second, natural and supernatural explanations rarely excluded one another. On the contrary, the prevailing strategy well into the 18th century was to heap up both kinds of causes in what looks to modernize like an impossible hodgepodge. So the 1348 earthquake was due simultaneously to subterranean vapors that were released from the Earth's interior and to God's exasperation with incompetent monarchs. The 1726 Palermo earthquake was both God's merciful warning to sinners and the result of subterranean caverns causing greatest damage to buildings erected on sandy soil. You find this in the very same treatise. This having your cake and eating it too approach baffles modern historians, whose philosophical sensibilities hold natural and supernatural causes to be immiscible. Either the event is natural and God has nothing to do with it, or it's supernatural and nature is overruled. Pre-modern thinkers, and as I say, you can find examples of this well into the 18th century, in contrast, distinguish between God's ordinary and extraordinary providence, which interpenetrated rather than canceling one another out. These two features hang together. It makes little sense to carve out a separate category of natural as opposed to divine or human disasters in a system of thought in which you have all three elements, the natural, the human, and the divine, tightly intertwined, although they're in theory separable. In order for natural disasters to coalesce into a coherent category, nature itself has to be reimagined as more coherent, a harmonious whole whose interlocking parts were in delicate equilibrium with one another. The 18th century Swedish naturalist Linnaeus described this system as an economy, and economy with OE rather than just E. The modern term is ecology. Both of these words derive from the ancient Greek oikos, meaning household, a self-contained unit dependent on a division of labor and continuous give and take among its elements. The equilibrium of the oikos is dynamic, because it's achieved through tension, a rope that's made taut and straight by a tug of war between opposing forces. Its harmony emerges only at the macroscopic level, both in space and in time. Viewed microscopically at a pinpoint place and moment, the members of the household or the organisms of the ecology incessantly jostle, elbow, and adjust to one another. The idea of an oikos is ancient, and it's what would now be described, as I said, as a local ecology. Long before there was a science of that name, people registered the order of local nature as the familiarity of home or the strangeness of the exotic. The ecology of a local nature is that characteristic combination of flora, fauna, topography, and climate that give a landscape its physiognomy. And we're all familiar with stereotypical examples: the desert oasis, the Mediterranean shore, the Siberian tundra, the jagged mountain tops. But both household and ecology are by definition circumscribed. They're rooted in the hearth and the region, respectively. The novelty of the vision of Linnaeus of the economy of nature as it emerged in the late 17th and 18th centuries was that it embraces nature as a whole, from the remotest stars to the tiniest mites. As I said earlier, this is the achievement of natural theology, not natural philosophy. Although many of these natural theologians were keenly interested in natural history and natural philosophy, and they made ample use of the latest discoveries to illustrate their works on bee theology, fish theology, rock theology, tulip theology, and on and on and on. Their most ambitious claims, and the ones most essential to their claims about nature as a harmonious whole, dwarfed all coeval and empirical inquiry. So I'll just take one example. This is the doyen of this genre, William Durham, Anglican vicar, Fellow of the Royal Society, Boyle Lecturer in 1712, pioneered this genre of natural theology with his Physico-theology, which was published in 1713. And it's very characteristic of Durham that he should begin with the entire atmosphere, the atmosphere or mass of air, vapors, and clouds which surrounded our globe will appear to be a matter of design and the infinitely wise Creator's work if we consider its nature and make in its use to the world. Now, equally characteristic of Durham, and indeed of this entire genre, is that there is no cloud so dark that he cannot turn it inside out and find a silver lining. So here is Durham on violent windstorms. Yes, they do destroy lives and property. Yet where would we be without the winds? Here is Durham's response. And if the whole mass of air and vapors were always at rest and without motion, instead of refreshing and animating, it would suffocate and poison all the world. Truly, it is an ill wind that blows no one good. Now, what is novel about this is not the compensatory logic per se. You can find examples of this as far back as Herodotus. Herodotus says, yes, the deserts of Arabia have all those precious jewels and gold, but boy, they've got a whole lot of poisonous snakes. We're better off in Greece. What's novel here is the global scope and the theological ambitions. As the late 17th century natural philosopher Robert Boyle put it, God doesn't govern the universe as a puppeteer, pulling this string and that string. Rather, he governs it as an engineer who had fashioned, as Boyle says, a rare clock, such as may be that at Strasbourg. And this clock at the cathedral at Strasbourg was celebrated in the 16th and 17th century because it had so many astronomical functions built into it. This meant for Boyle that any, what he delicately called anomalies, which run the gamut from earthquakes to monstrous births, all of these anomalies ought to be interpreted as serving, as he says, ends unknown to us, that God very well foresaw and thought fit that such seeming anomalies should come to pass. So God's first priority is the welfare of the universe as a whole, not that of any individual creature. The price for God's preference for global uniformity over local benevolence was, as Boyle says, some seeming irregularity such as earthquakes, floods, famines, and company, incommodious to particular creatures, are no other than such as he foresaw would happen, as not unsuitable to some other of those wise ends which he may have in his all-pervading views. So God's perspective is panoramic. His mercy is statistical. The question of guilt here, whether it's human, natural, or divine, is key. Since nature, in this view, as being a kind of engine, a clock, has been deprived of agency, nature can hardly bear any responsibility for these disasters. But nor does God, even though he foresaw and willed them. For however devastating the effects might be locally, some greater good was served. There's a kind of cosmic bookkeeping that's going on here that, smooths out the damage of an earthquake here, a volcano there. This leaves only human beings to be responsible, and in earlier accounts of the medieval tribulationes, they deserved everything they got. If there's one phrase that recurs over and over again in the sermons preached on the occasion of disasters, it was that cessante causa cessabit et effectus. Stop the cause and you'll stop the effect. Stop whatever you're doing and God will stop inflicting tribulations upon us. So in contrast to this relatively straightforward case of crime and punishment, the natural theological treatises also let humans off the hook, at least insofar as local disasters were meted out in retribution for local transgressions. If the overall economy of nature requires a flood here in order to avert a drought there, specific blame assigned to flood victims made no sense, although preachers sometimes took the occasion to admonish everyone everywhere to repent and improve. Increasingly, blaming the victims for their own misfortunes seemed to be at very least at odds with Christian charity, and at worst, well, like blaming the victims. Like God's views, human responsibility had also become all-pervading and therefore dilute. Enlightenment natural theologians exploited this all-round exculpatory logic to the hilt. The Swiss naturalist and theologian Johann Jakob Scheuchzer, this is a plate from his lavishly illustrated Physica Sacra of 1731, took a rosy view of the biblical flood. It promoted industry in the rebuilding. The violent thunderstorms that ravaged Switzerland, his native Switzerland in 1731, true, many sheep, many people killed, but the vineyards flourished the next year. Although Voltaire's withering satire on such obtuse optimism in Candide of 1759 dominates our view of the 1755 Lisbon earthquake, the numerous contemporary responses to this calamity canvass almost every position, from the apocalyptic to the aesthetic, with natural theology represented, including at least one treatise devoted entirely to earthquake theology. I'll just read you Benjamin Franklin's response, in which he out-Panglosses Pangloss. He says in a letter shortly after the Lisbon earthquake, the churning up of the otherwise inaccessible rocks had put a great variety of useful materials into human hands, which would otherwise have remained eternally concealed from us, so that what has been usually looked upon as a ruin suffered by this part of the universe was in reality only a preparation or means of rendering the earth more fit for use, more capable of being to mankind a convenient and comfortable habitation. Natural disasters might seem particularly well suited to perpetuate divine wrath interpretations, and I must say those are never absent from the 18th century and indeed later sermon literature. But there was, however, a growing tendency to reject such explanations not just as wrong, but as blasphemous. By the early 19th century, even the sermon literature, which is the most conservative, increasingly distanced itself from this unseemly spectacle of divine temper tantrums laying waste to life and property. So, for example, after a storm surge of February 1825 flooded the Netherlands, natural theological sermons praised God's charity in thus getting rid of all the rats, and attacked those who viewed the flood as divine punishment for portraying the Heavenly Father as, quote, a barbarian. It was against this background that the category of the specifically natural disaster crystallized in 18th century Europe. Pinpointing precisely when is difficult, in part because the terminology varies not only between languages, but within the same language. So we have in English, for example, natural disaster and natural catastrophe. Moreover, the words disaster, as you can tell by the etymology, it originally means ill-starred. And catastrophe have fascinating histories of their own. But at least as early as 1740, I found the term Naturübel in a German lexicon, and I'm not sure how trustworthy this evidence, but here's what Google Ngram says. Okay, so this is for natural catastrophe, and you can see that it's dead flat until about 1800, and then there's sort of little squiggles, and then with a steep rise in the middle decades of the 20th century. I'm much more interested in the little squiggles around 1800 than I am the steep rise, because I don't know about you, but every time I do a Google Ngram, there's a steep rise toward the end of the 20th century, even though allegedly these are relative figures. So here's désastre naturel, which shows something not unlike, and here's Naturkatastrophe in German. By conceiving of nature as a stable, integrated economy, now economy OE, natural theologians elevated divine good governance at the expense of divine wrath. Apparent local aberrations in the smooth course of nature, in fact, safeguarded the equilibrium of the whole. The God who attended to the sparrow's fall gave way to the God of overall uniformities. With hindsight, the conception of nature as a closed system held in exquisitely engineered equipoise suggests an autonomous nature, cut loose from God, and that, of course, is the departure point for those secularization narratives. But from the standpoint of the natural theologians, these very same qualities testified to the wisdom and justice of Deus Legislator, whose laws need never be repealed, never amended, never bent. The integrity of nature and the distinctiveness of natural disasters was primarily the creation of Enlightenment theology, not Enlightenment science. So as a result of these zones, nature became guilt-free for much of the 19th and 20th centuries, at least as far as liabilities for disasters was concerned. Even if you constrain this story to the flat plane of philosophy, the implications of this idea are too labyrinthine to follow here. I'm just going to give you a few arresting examples from the two realms charged with dealing with the theoretical and practical consequences of natural disasters, moral philosophy and law, respectively. In Anglo-American law, the act of God became almost synonymous with natural disasters, and in moral philosophy, natural disasters raised the problem of evil in its most pressing form. So when Tennyson wrote bitterly of nature as a hollow form with empty hands, and refused to embrace her as my natural good, he captured the horrified sense, the 19th century sense, of nature as a theater of senseless violence. This is a sense that haunts not just poets and theologians, but also some of the most militantly unreligious philosophers and scientists, people like Thomas Henry Huxley and John Stuart Mill. In contrast to the injunctions of Enlightenment natural theology, moral philosophy, and political theory, from Alexander Pope to Jean-Jacques Rousseau to Thomas Jefferson, namely to seek the good in nature, mid-19th century thinkers shuddered in the face of nature's waste and devastation, all of it devoid of purpose. By the 1870s, progressive intellectuals were busy erecting a firewall between nature and ethics. Although John Stuart Mill thundered against any appeal to nature in the realm of ethics, he did stop short of personifying nature. But he couldn't refrain from pointing out that if human beings behaved in the way that nature did, they would be condemned as the most heinous murderers in history. He writes, "In sober truth, nearly all the things which men are hanged or imprisoned for are nature's everyday performances. It was imperative to insulate ethics from nature, nature now imagined to be on the rampage." Natural disasters and their vertiginous variety of interpretations track these changes. The distinctively modern view, the post-Enlightenment view, of these events is that they are ethically meaningless, even if humanly tragic. No one and no thing bears any responsibility, not because all is ultimately in the hands of God, but because the natural in natural disasters places them beyond good and evil. In modern philosophy, the problem of evil no longer has anything to do with theodicy, that is, why does God make good people suffer? Rather, it is the puzzle of meaningless suffering, pain that is not redemptive, destruction that is not creative, dark clouds that are not lined with silver but rather with lead. The natural disaster, simply one tribulation among many until the 18th century, had become paradigmatic of such inexplicable evil, more darkly mysterious than even the monstrous human who commits atrocities. To assign responsibility is the beginning of making ethical sense of even the most horrendous crimes. A natural disaster blocks even this first step. As the New York Times says, you can't blame a volcano. In this theoretical scheme of things, only humans can shoulder responsibility. And in the practical sphere, that is just what 20th century court decisions that applied the increasingly archaic-sounding category of acts of God obliged them to do. As the term suggests, the act of God in jurisprudence was originally saturated with providential associations. However, the legal evolution of the term in both American and British law has been from the divine to the banal. Take, for example, a 1919 California review of all the American cases in an attempt to sharpen the definition of exactly what constituted an act of God. Following Lord Mansfield's 18th century definition, the acts of God were opposed to those of man. Quoting now from the California Review, "Such acts as could not happen by the intervention of man, as storms, lightnings, and tempests." But the import of more recent United States case law had extended the term to cover any event that was merely unforeseeable, at least to such an extent that no human prevention was possible. So, for example, jettisoning a cargo at sea in a storm in order to save lives counted as an act of God in terms of liability for the abandoned goods, even though the loss was accomplished by the immediate agency of man. 19th and 20th century British law, based upon equally humdrum cases, had converged upon similar conclusions. In two cases involving damage to neighbors' property caused by artificial pools that overflowed after unusually heavy rainfall, and decided by the courts in apparently contradictory fashion, the nub of the issue was, quote, what could be reasonably anticipated and failure reasonably to guard against it. The overall tendency of these legal commentaries was to extend the radius of human responsibility. Could the disaster that caused the damages have been reasonably foreseen? And if so, could precautions have been reasonably taken to mitigate its consequences? It was not necessary to wheel out the heavy philosophical canons to shoot down providential interpretations of events. The sheer banality of the cases, soggy dry goods, a puddling pool for children in a public park, must have discouraged any attempt to drag in the deity. even when the disaster was of apocalyptic proportions and entirely unpredictable, as in the case of the San Francisco earthquake of April 1906, the courts generally decided in the direction of greater liability. In this case, that of the insurance companies to pay compensation, even if the policies had an earthquake exemption. So you'll notice here that not only have the buildings been destroyed by the earthquake, but the city is in flames, and indeed 80% of the damage of the San Francisco earthquake was caused by the fires. In vain do the insurers point to the act of God and force majeure exclusionary clauses in their fire insurance contracts. Courts in both the United States and in Europe ruled that claims must be paid since the proximate cause of destruction was fire, not the earthquake. Since they were the ones who ultimately footed the bill, the reinsurers in particular were chary of taking on such potentially open-ended liabilities and devoted considerable legal energy to enforcing a hard and fast distinction between man-made and natural disasters. The one generally insurable and the other generally are not. Okay, we're now going to fast forward to the 1970s. Since about the 1970s, the world's largest reinsurance companies, Munich Reinsurance, Swiss Reinsurance, have begun to rethink their policies on natural disasters. The reasons are multiple and complex, and I can only offer a preliminary sketch here, but I think the overall tendency is quite clear. Over a period of around 30 years, companies like Munich and Swiss Re shifted their stance from one of risk aversion, no earthquakes, no natural disasters, to risk-seeking in the realm of natural disasters. And from an approach of damage prevention based on on-site inspections, for example, of an oil refinery in Libya, to one of mathematical modeling, for example, of tornadoes for the next 50,000 years. And you can see this just in their staff. So if you look at the staff of one of these reinsurance companies in their sort of their risk management team, it's composed mostly of mechanical and chemical engineers around 1970. And what these guys do is they go to Libya, they go to that oil refinery, they kick the machinery, they crawl on their hands and knees to make sure that everything is in order, and they often write a report about how the safety standards of the factory or the refinery could be upgraded in order to prevent possible explosions or damage. If you go to the 1990s, what you see are physicists, mathematicians, economists, lots of MBAs on their risk management teams, and they are no longer traveling to factories. They're not going anywhere. They are assembling huge statistical databases, vast historical databases. They're actually employing medievalists to get a longer database for earthquakes in Europe. And they're developing mathematical models in order to predict future such disasters. And they're publishing glossy brochures about them, like this one, or this one, a thinly disguised attempt to drum up more business, storm over Europe, an underestimated risk. What's new in this approach is first, natural disasters of almost all kinds are now considered insurable. And second, the radius of human responsibility for losses from natural disasters has lengthened, and the burden of responsibility has shifted from individuals to governments. And third, natural disasters as a specific category has been eroded by a more all-encompassing approach to all risks everywhere. Each of these three developments deserves a volume in its own right, but let me just sketch the outlines for you. So traditionally, insurers have refused to write policies for earthquakes and other sudden, violent, unpredictable natural disasters because they violate every precautionary principle of the business. So first, the damages are localized rather than geographically and temporally distributed. You can't calculate the probabilities of occurrence. Pace, that court in Italy that sentenced the seismologists. And finally, the costs are potentially unlimited because of secondary effects like fires, and you can write a watertight exclusionary clause, but as in the case of San Francisco, the courts won't let it stand. Quoting from an insurance brochure of the 1950s, it is easy to see that earthquake hazard does not obey these rules and thus deprives the insurer of the little security he has acquired over the last 2 centuries. This same prohibition applies to cyclones, volcanoes, tornadoes, avalanches, typhoons, and other traditional acts of God, for which the insurance companies wanted the strictest possible exclusionary clauses. But by the early 1990s, this ban is softening, even though the possible deleterious effects of climate change were being taken more and more seriously and damages were rising, especially in competitive, lucrative markets like the United States. Why? Part of the answer surely is market pressure, especially in these competitive markets like North America. Primary insurers found themselves forced to offer policies on risks that warier reinsurers frowned upon. And again, the courts, again, most extravagantly but not exclusively in the United States, tended to award victims of natural disasters damages in suits against insurance companies, ignoring those exclusionary clauses. But these were pressures to which reinsurers might have grudgingly capitulated, not embraced with open arms. However, by the mid-1990s, reinsurers were actively courting business in reinsurance for natural disasters, as its series of lavishly illustrated brochures dedicated to one or another natural disasters like this one bears witness. The very unpredictability of natural disasters and the havoc they wrought, which had previously made such events uninsurable, now became the rationale for issuing policies. Sophisticated models and simulations allegedly tamed risk, even when statistics were non-existent and predictability nil. And you'll see here the assumptions of into loss potentials in billions of US dollars from a recent brochure from Swiss Reinsurance. You can see the results of this inverted logic to best advantage if you look now at the natural disasters that the insurers and the reinsurers refuse to insure. They won't touch them with a 10-foot pole. Not earthquakes, not hurricanes, not volcanoes, not floods. Sorry, but floods. They will not insure floods anymore. Why? Floods occur with considerable regularity in many parts of the world, and that's the problem. Losses that recur every few years are in principle foreseeable and should therefore be excluded from insurance cover. In the teeth of centuries of effort by insurance companies to cleanse themselves of the taint of the gambling casino, the new natural disaster models proclaimed that the ideal of an insurable event was one that was totally aleatory, as random as the roll of dice. The more foreseeable the natural disaster and its consequences, the greater the responsibility for taking precautions, a principle of reasonableness already established by the early 20th century in court decisions pertaining to the act of God. But who was supposed to be the prudential agent in such cases? According to the insurers and the reinsurers, the state must rush in where insurers fear to tread. By zoning regulations that punish those who built in floodplains, by solidarity taxes that spread the burden of losses across the entire population, by disaster relief programs and low-cost rebuilding loans to assist the victims, by dikes, embankments, and barriers, for example, like the Thames Barrier, designed to protect London from a once-in-a-millennium storm surge. And who but the government could prevent the concentration of industry in vulnerable areas, or indeed invest the money in the scientific research that would eventually perfect predictions? The prudence of individuals was unavailing in the face of tsunamis, dam bursts, mud flows, and yes, meteorite impacts. For how was the average citizen even to know about such lurking dangers without a government-sponsored information campaign? And if, despite all of these precautions, the worst still came to pass, the state was also to blame for faulty planning and inadequate relief efforts. Accountability knew no limits. This was not only the self-interested view of the insurance industry. Starting in the mid-1990s, development economists and sociologists began to publish their own case studies on how governments around the world could alleviate the effects of natural disasters by enforcing building codes, installing early warning systems, offering state-sponsored insurance, conducting public awareness campaigns, resettling people who were forced by poverty to live in high-risk zones, and building hospitals with large trauma wards. Unsurprisingly, their results showed that underdeveloped countries suffered more in terms of deaths and damage, although not, as you'll see, necessarily in terms of costs. The OECD countries are the ones that really rack up the costs in the case of a natural disaster. And, unsurprisingly, the poor suffer more in all countries than the rich. You can see this in the case of the United States. So perhaps no place on earth has more savage weather than the United States. So if you think about the United States versus the map of Europe, the United States has its mountain range, the Rockies, going from north to south. So there's a barrier between the east and the west, but hot air from the south and cold air from the north can mingle, producing all the bizarreries of American weather. In the case of Europe, you've got the Alps blocking south and north. So although from time to time there is outre weather, it's nothing like the melodrama of American weather. But, so you would think the United States, because of its ill-starred geography, would have a much higher death rate from disasters. Not at all, because precautionary measures had been taken. In the lingo of the disaster economists, the number of deaths per disaster remains relatively low. So quite independent of the most recent scientific findings on climate change, the force of these social science studies has been also to spotlight human responsibility, or rather, the responsibility of human governments. The third feature of the new risk management approach to natural disasters is the dissolution of the very category, and that's simply a corollary of the other two factors. So if the definition of an insurable risk stresses randomness, there's nothing in principle to distinguish the modeling techniques that aim to predict typhoons from those that track market volatility. And if the impact of natural disasters is greatly exacerbated by human malfeasance, the natural fades into the background. Only disasters. You can see this in, this is the 2011 Davos World Economic Forum report on global risks, and you can sort of see this melting pot approach. They have sort of clusters here of kinds of risks. So the green ones are environmental risks, the red ones are geopolitical risks, sort of blue-gray ones are technological risks. And you can see that they're all represented as being networked with one another, so that migration, food security, biodiversity loss, weapons of mass destruction, it's all much of a muchness. So, in conclusion, have we come full circle? We've gotten rid, or are on our way to getting rid of the category of natural disasters. Have we gone back to the medieval category of tribulations? And we've gone from being sinners in the hands of an angry God to innocent victims in the grip of indifferent nature to culprits justly punished by nature's revenge. It does seem to be the case that great tectonic plates are sliding and colliding in our minds, grinding down the distinctions between the natural and the human, and not just in this case, but of course also in the discussions of genetic engineering, anthropogenic climate change, as well as the nature of risk. But it would be premature to conclude that just because the sharp boundary between the natural and the human was characteristically modern. Any blurring of that line ipso facto returns us to pre-modern concepts. Nature's Revenge is thoroughly contemporary for all its apparent resonances with medieval allegories of Dame Nature or God's proxy. The nature that takes its revenge in today's headlines about disasters is neither personified nor deified. You can certainly caricature nature in a cartoon like this one from Florida Today, but with an irony that undercuts any serious construal of intentions in hurricanes or wildfires. Even proponents of the Gaia hypothesis, which envisioned the Earth as a living organism, quickly admit that it is not alive in a sentient way or even alive like an animal or bacterium. Rather, nature takes its revenge as a self-regulating system, like a thermostat, for example. The general principle is the same, whether the system is an organism, the solar system, or a machine. Small shocks will push the system out of equilibrium, but it will regain its equilibrium if the shocks are small enough. But if the system is jolted too often and too violently, it starts to fluctuate chaotically. Organs fail, moons spin off on tangents, machinery explodes. The mechanism for nature's revenge is just that. It is a mechanism. But why revenge? Why not just unintentionally cause disequilibria? Negligent, perhaps, but not malevolent. Why does guilt still saturate our understanding of natural disasters? I promised at the outset that I'd talk not only about an idea, but an emotion, and now I've finally come to it. Nature's revenge is never invoked unless there is human complicity in the disaster. Even if no one willed the devastation, there are those greedy developers who sold floodplain real estate. There are those lazy politicians who didn't maintain the dikes, the corrupt officials who allowed construction companies to ignore building codes, the self-indulgence of industrialized nations that refuse to reduce carbon emissions. It's very telling that the phrase nature's revenge cropped up in editorializing on the March 2011 disasters in Japan almost exclusively in connection with the accident at the Fukushima nuclear power plant. Not the earthquake, not the tsunami that triggered the accident, even though the latter cost 3 orders of magnitude more lives and were demonstrably more natural. Only where human hubris, greed, or sloth can be laid bare does nature's revenge come into play, no matter how horrendous the havoc wrought by other disasters. The paradoxical consequence of ever deeper inquiry into the natural causes of devastation has been to expose human motives, turning natural disasters into sagas of crime and punishment, at least at the local level. It remains to be seen if the idea of nature's revenge will survive the globalization of risk and responsibility. Global risk assessment of the sort I just showed you has outdone the natural theological vision of a global economy of nature in its all-pervading views of all kinds of hazards, all over the world, all interconnected. Perhaps one reason why perceived responsibility has flowed from individuals to governments in recent years is that only the state has the means to survey these tangled interactions panoramically, and, at least so the hope, to keep them in balance. Disappointments on this score, most recently in the context of attempts to arrest and reverse climate change, have been many and bitter. Nonetheless, the perception of the entire world, both nature and culture, as one huge interacting economy, and now Linnaeus's economy with an OE, seems to be spreading. Oikos, the household, originally defined as the essence of the local, but all 3 of its descendants, ecology, economy with an O, and economy with an E, seem well on their way to becoming planetary. Thank you for your attention.